Hold on to your butt.
Da-da-da. You were saying?
Welcome to episode 139 of the Civil War Breakfast Club podcast. I'm your co-host, Mary, and as always, I am joined by my co-host, Darren, who has marched alongside me for these 139 episodes.
Wow. Hi, Mary. How we doing?
I'm not even going to get that was clever.
I think we're beyond that at this point. By episode 139, I guess.
I thought about that one all day today.
Well, you're very creative. A job well done. Anyway, what's going on with you? How are you?
Wow, I got a well in that instead of a job done.
It was more of a well, but it's okay. So yeah, it's been a while since we recorded just us two. We've been doing some shenanigans.
Yeah, we've had guests on. We had Cody Ishon from the seminary a few weeks ago. We got to record live. So thanks again to the Seminary Ridge Museum for inviting us to their 24 Hours on the Ridge to record that episode with Cody. And before that, we did our episode with our awesome friend Jay Price, the Halloween episode, our Halloween Spooktacular, which was awesome. But we are back, just the two of us. And I think I need to start things off and be a gracious host by asking, what are you drinking tonight?
Wow. Thank you, Mary. I'm drinking, it's called Brew Free Blood Orange IPA from 21st Amendment, I believe that's what that's from.
Yep.
And I'm drinking it out of my Civil War reenactor mug, Mary, because all the mugs we have for this are still packed away somewhere, so I have to use my metal mug. So anyway, that's what I'm doing. Thanks so much for asking. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate it. I will reciprocate now and ask you, my goodness gracious, what are you drinking?
I'm also drinking a beer from 21st Amendment, but I'm drinking Tall Hat, which is a beer named after the guy in the hat that we often talk about, Abraham Lincoln. He's also on their logo. Anybody who has not tried 21st Amendment Brewing, it is a great brewery. They have some really great IPAs, and I am drinking it out of my General Grant mug, although he's not really, he's not the star of tonight's episode. He's still mentioned in it, so I thought, I know it's a bit of a reach, but yeah, the Sherman mugs are still packed away, unfortunately, so we'll get those out eventually.
That's okay. Well, anyway, Mary, today we're going to talk about General William T. Sherman's March to the Sea, which got underway just about 160 years ago this week. And a lot has been written about this 285-mile walk to the beach from Atlanta to Savannah, but we aren't going to focus on the actual march and destruction to the Georgian countryside. We're going to focus anyway on the lead up to it. Why did Sherman want to make this march considering the military situation in the second half of 1864? And more importantly, how did he make the case for this plan, which is going to result in the most famous or infamous events in American history? And the thing about it is, there's so much that goes into it.
There's a lot that goes into the march with the planning, and just all that has to be done. And, Sherman has to start somewhere with it, but I think it's important to talk about just the situation in 1864, that this is a very brutal year of the Civil War. Not that the previous years, 1861, 62, and 63 weren't brutal. They are. But 1864 sees it taken to a kind of a whole other level of warfare. You have battles like Spotsylvania during the Overland Campaign, the Battle of Cold Harbor, really, really brutal fighting in those battles. You have... Sherman doing his Atlanta campaign as well. Lots of battles on that. You also have Washington, D.C. being threatened by Jubal Early, but luckily, as we know at the Battle of Monocacy, General Lew Wallace is able to slow him down. Although it's not a victory for the Union, he slows him down enough and it stops Jubal Early from getting into Washington, D.C., which, because 1864 is an election year, that would have, who knows what that would have caused, but not good things. And it's also the year that the war changes. This is the year in which we are going to see total warfare begin. And this actually begins with Sherman's Meridian Campaign, which we're going to talk a little bit about later when we talk a little bit more about, some of the inspiration behind the March to the Sea. Happens in February. And then we also see the total warfare starting to happen with General Phil Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley. Actually, it's not starting to happen. It is. It's complete total warfare. We did our episode about the burning of the valley a few weeks ago, and just how Sheridan was told to wreck the valley, and he does that. And it will ultimately culminate with the Battle of Cedar Creek. And that burning happens in late September, early October 1864. And again, this is total war, and this is all happening before the March to the Sea, which is going to start on November 15th, 1864.
Right. I mean, the thing about it, though, is, suffice it to say, William T. Sherman, he's probably the most polarizing man in Civil War history. And if you don't believe me, Mary, simply go on to any Confederate Facebook page, write his name, and wait for the fireworks. No pun intended, right? But the thing about it, though, whether or not he achieved the goals, that total war goals we talked about, or was even worth it, is up to modern-day historians and modern-day Civil War buffs. But the thing about it, though, Sherman's plan was hardly a whim, and one that was designed to expedite the end of the war, thus saving lives by crushing rebel morale and traumatizing the Georgian population. And we kind of talked about the why, and we go back to understand in that way back machine, Mary. If we could turn back time.
If I could turn back time.
Why do that to people? But go back to early 64, which you hinted at, and look at that military and political situation. In that new phase you talked about, which started more of that trench warfare as the generals learned that reality of modern-day weapons of the time had clearly passed the Napoleonic style of war. And just talking about the things you talked about, though, in the Western theater, the Confederates had been driven out of Chattanooga, and which had left the Deep South wide open and vulnerable to those Union forces. But again, while this is all going on, that Union command structure is also going on through some changes as well. March of 1864, Mary, General U.S. Grant, the guy you hinted at, that you couldn't find the mug. He was named lieutenant.
I could find his mug. It was Sherman's mug I couldn't find.
Oh, okay. Confuse the two. But he's named lieutenant general commanding all Union armies, and he introduced that theory you talked about of total war. And again, instead of exclusively fighting Confederate armies, he wanted to attack the rebels' ability to make war. By attacking the military infrastructure, he would potentially destroy their capacity to fight, thus ending the war, right? And Grant had many willing subordinates to help him achieve this goal. And his closest was General William Tecumseh Sherman. We've talked about him already.
The ultimate BFFs.
Absolutely. Now, we aren't going to go into Sherman's background, but by 1864, Sherman and Grant were very, very close. I mean, they were finishing each other's sentences. They were having feety pajama sleepovers. They were doing it all, right? Grant had helped Sherman back in the Army after he suffered that nervous breakdown. And from that point on, his loyalties remained firmly with Grant. Now, when you look at the military situation, Grant's grand plan in 1864 was a 5-pronged, bold plan, and he felt he finally had the right men to pull this thing off. So really, we're not going to talk in detail of what it was, but basically the 5-pronged attack, General Nathaniel Banks, Mary, from Waltham, Massachusetts, the second most famous guy from Waltham. Anyway.
Did he push shopping carts at people?
Oh, God. Destruction. But he, along with some naval forces under David Dixon Porter, they're going to initiate what will be called the Red River Campaign, which was supposed to wipe out Confederate control of the port of Shreveport, Louisiana, but it didn't work because General Edmund Kirby Smith, he caused some problems that ended up being a complete fiasco for them. George Meade, perhaps you've heard of him, Mary, in the Army of the Potomac here in the East. He's going to target Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in what will, of course, be known as the Overland Campaign. Benjamin Spoons Butler, Mary, another Mass guy, he would threaten Richmond from the James River. And in that Shenandoah Valley you talked about a few minutes ago, initially it'll be Franz Sigel who will enter the valley to try to take control of that rebel breadbasket and shut off Lee's food supply in the valley. David Hunter took over after that. It fell apart. They're
not the most talented individuals.
The whole thing, the whole thing's a mess. And then William Sherman, he's going to seize Atlanta, that huge railroad hub that distributed foods, weapons, supplies throughout the South. Taking Atlanta would go a long way in making Grant's total war strategy possible. So obviously, the point of this episode here is we're going to focus on Sherman's exploits. And we talked in the past a lot about Sherman's Atlantic campaign. So let's jump ahead to September 2nd, 1864, when Atlanta finally falls to Sherman's forces.
Yeah. And so September 2nd, it's actually Slocum's men that go into Atlanta. Actually, Colonel David Ireland from Gettysburg fame was one of the first ones into Atlanta. He will actually set up his residence where John Bell Hood has his residence. As we know, Ireland, unfortunately, will pass away within a week. But anyway, so you have Sherman and his army. So he has, Oliver Otis Howard with him. He has Slocum and he has Thomas with him. On September 3rd, 1864, Howard is going to write his wife from his headquarters at Lovejoy Station, which is just outside of Atlanta. And he tells her of the fall of Atlanta. No doubt she's probably heard of it. But he says, "You would think there would be a battle going on by the Sound, but it is only cannonading and skirmishing. I do not much expect another battle in Georgia." And Howard's not really wrong about that. There's not going to be another major battle in that state. other than one we're going to talk about briefly called Allatoona Pass, but then Griswoldville on the Atlanta campaign. On September 20th, 1864, and this is going to give people an idea of just how things are starting to go, and it's going to set up just in some ways how the march, Sherman struggled with it to even be able to happen to get permission. And this is because of General John Bill Hood. September 20th, 1864, Sherman is going to send a telegram to Howard stating that he may have to support 2 of General Thomas's brigades as they are trying to find Hood. Sherman also mentions that he has spies tonight at Macon to watch which way Hood goes. I think he will move back to Macon and Sandtown or to Richmond. So Sherman doesn't really know what Hood's plans are at this point. But the other thing, too, that is happening as these men are sitting in Atlanta is they're learning of news back home. And the election is on their minds. And Howard mentions in a letter from September 22nd that there's a great deal of Union sentiment here in Georgia, but every mouth has been shut for a long time by the fearful tyranny. I believe General Grant will accomplish his portion of the campaign before winter. If he succeeds, matters will put a much different complexion. And Howard then says he doesn't know what's going to happen. And he also says he doesn't know, what is going to happen with the army, like where are they going to go next? Because so much is dependent on what John Bell Hood is going to do. And that is what Grant is telling Sherman, that he needs to know what Hood is up to.
Well, they had, his plan was to take Atlanta.
Yeah.
But they never really talked about it. What do we do when we finish? I mean, it took 3 months, 3 weeks, and 5 days for Sherman to go from Chattanooga to Atlanta. The North is in jubilation. The South is in mourning. Southern diarist Mary Chestnut famously writes of the fall of Atlanta, "We are going to be wiped off the earth," right? But for the next few months, you're right, Sherman and his army, they're resting in Atlanta, enjoying whatever the city had to offer, including those 3 DQ locations throughout the Atlanta metro area, Mary. And Sherman, he said, "We felt perfectly at home, and we had ample supplies from Chattanooga." But again, they focused so much on getting to Atlanta. I guess we'll cross the next bridge when we get to it, right? It's during this occupation.
Or burn it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's during this occupation, November 8th, that Lincoln is going to win that second term, that clear message from the voters that they saw the war as winnable now and felt confident in his leadership to finish it. But the thing about it, though, is that Sherman, he achieved that objective, getting Atlanta, one of the biggest things out of those 5 ideas that they had that Grant wanted.
Well, he was convinced that when he took Atlanta, he says in his memoirs, this is going to secure the election for Abraham Lincoln.
So it's kind of like you've finished the marathon, you've crossed the finish line, then you go, now what, right? Because he realized that despite of finishing this goal and achieving this objective, and he knew he couldn't stay there forever. He was deep in enemy territory. He knew he couldn't stay in Atlanta. His army consisted of 80,000 hungry men and only had one supply line, which was a single railroad track on the Western and Atlantic Railroad connecting Atlanta back to Chattanooga and then to Nashville. And the problem was, Mary, there's always problems.
Yep.
The supply line was vulnerable, and Sherman knew it. And he knew it was a matter of time that when cavalry under Nathan Bedford Forrest and Joseph Wheeler, they would attack it. And not to mention the angry and defeated commander of the Army of Tennessee, John Bell Hood, how he was going to react. And we talked about those letters, right? Sherman, he adds insult to injury to Hood when on September 7th of 1864, he will order Special Order GTFO to the 146 civilian families, which is 1,600 total older men, women, and children, to vacate the dance floor of Atlanta ASAP. Now again, what is Sherman doing here? He's booting them from their homes, heading into the Georgia winter, because it would take too much of his men to police them and protect them in case of a rebel attack. Hood felt this order was, in quote, appalling and was uncivilized, ingenious cruelty, which led to that epic insult-felt letters back and forth between the two commanders. And so this is the situation what Sherman finds himself in after he does get to Atlanta.
Yeah, and it's funny, I found a great quote from Roland Howard's brother writes him a letter, and he has seen, I guess the letters were published in one of the newspapers. By the way, if you want to know more about those letters, listen to, I think it's episode 4 of our podcast.
No, we don't need any negative reviews for the language, so why don't we stop that?
Oh, God.
Well, just ignore that episode ever exists.
Jeez. That's probably the one the person listened to. Anyway, so Rowland says to Howard, "I'm delighted with Sherman's letters to the mayor of Atlanta and Hood. Sherman has a way of putting things in writing that is almost as good as victory at arms," which is like, that's such a great way to explain these letters. But the other thing too is like, so with Hood, this is something that Sherman, it's kind of like Hood's that kind of like that annoying fly that you can't quite swat, right? It keeps buzzing around. I think that's kind of how Sherman is viewing Hood at this point.
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, I think he saw him not so much as a nuisance. I think he saw him as a potential real angry threat.
Yeah.
Who could really screw him up.
Well, September 25th, Sherman does say that, "I have no doubt that Hood has resolved to throw himself on our flank to prevent our accumulating stores, etc. here, trusting to our not advancing into Georgia."
Well, I mean, if you could read these letters in the pure venom, and you could see that by 64, they just about had it. Mm-hmm. Sherman's going to write, and quote, to Hood, "War is war and not popularity seeking. Those who brought war into this country deserve all the courses and malediction that people can pour out." Great insult right there. But again, this is what's going on. So from between September 11th and the 20th, these civilians are going to slowly exit the city. And now Sherman can put his attention specifically on Hood's 40,000-man Army of Tennessee, which kind of had Sherman pinned into Atlanta and threatened that supply line. But again, this is not what Sherman wanted. Sherman had been thinking for a while. Grant and the powers that be in Washington really wanted Sherman to chase Hood into Tennessee and destroy the army.
Yeah.
Wherever he goes, Tennessee, the moon, wherever. Just chase, destroy his army. But here's the thing, though. While Sherman was sitting around whittling, okay, do whatever he was doing, okay, he was
starting fires.
He had other ideas, and for a while, he had come up with a new and ballsy plan that up to that point he kept to himself, but now wrote to Grant about what he wanted to do. And that was, of course, instead of chasing Hood and maintaining that supply line to Chattanooga and Nashville, he wanted to exit Atlanta and march his men through Georgia and target Savannah on the Atlantic coast. And again, this was a plan that was extremely brazen in a lot of different ways. The biggest reason why is he's going to abandon that supply line that they were so focused on protecting and living off the land.
Yeah.
Kind of like new homeless, living off the land, right?
That's pretty much what they were for the entire time.
But the thing about it, though, Sherman had done his homework. And this, like I said, this was not a whim. By studying the 1860 census, those maps of Georgia, he knew the best way to go and how to best feed his army along the way. He famously wrote, "Where 1 million people live, my army won't starve." And the thing about it, though, is he planted that seed of his plan in Grant's head. And he wrote to him, from Sherman to Grant, "If you can whip Lee and I can march to the Atlantic, I think Uncle Gabe will give us 20 days leave of absence to see the young folks." Okay, he's trying to do that whole thing.
Yeah.
But the thing about it, though, Sherman, he was not the best military tactician.
No, he's brilliant at planning. He's so good at planning, and that's what the March to the Sea shows, is what a great planner he is. But when it came to military tactics, no, he's not General Grant.
No, he's like Lionel Richie.
Yeah.
He's very overrated.
Yeah.
Okay, that's exactly what he was. He was an outstanding strategist and a problem solver, and he proved himself that it could be done earlier in the year, right?
Yes.
So February 3rd to March 6th, 1864, what happens?
He is going to go on his Meridian campaign, this is where he's going to lead approximately 20,000 men on a raid from Vicksburg east to Meridian, Mississippi. This is a distance of, what was it, about
135 miles.
And on this, he also made, he's going to employ tactics on this that he will employ in the March to the Sea. So, for instance, he made it look like his objective was going to be Mobile, Alabama. It's not. Mm-hmm. But he does that with both of his wings on the March to the Sea.
Yes.
As well.
Yeah.
Yep.
I'm nodding in agreement.
Okay. And on this campaign, Sherman noticed how hard it was for the enemy to concentrate against him, because with the two wings, any effort to oppose one wing could be undone through flanking threat posed by the other. So the enemy's not going to come at him. And Sherman on this also had limited number of wagons that accompanied the columns, and his men lived off the land. and they also tore up the railway lines. So he realized he could tear up the infrastructure, he could live off the land, and he could also, spook the people living in the area because he's coming in and taking stuff. Well, he's not, but his men are coming in and taking stuff from them. But Sherman said this: when the provisions, forage, horses, mules, wagons, etc., are by the enemy, it is clearly our duty and right to take them. So therefore, if they can use them, we have to stop them. And that's how he saw it too. But the other thing he realized on the Meridian campaign was when he knew that these civilians were scared, that this total war, this concept of this, was not just, it's getting away from traditional battles. It is a psychological warfare, and it is being now waged against the citizens.
Well, I mean, psychological warfare.
Yeah.
This was been going on for a while.
Yeah.
Right? Right here in Gettysburg, you had Confederate cavalry roll through here, scared the hell out of poor Tilly Pierce.
Yeah.
Right, and the locals in town. So scaring the locals was always a thing. But you're right, though. This was a prelude to his march through Georgia. And it was successful because it did prove that he could live off the land without a supply line, and it was doable. And he also knew there was some historical precedence to such a march, too. In the Mexican War, Mary, Winfield Scott, he'd made a similar march from Veracruz to Mexico City. And conversely, there was a disastrous march by one Napoleon Bonaparte, Mary. Okay?
One does not go into Russia in the winter.
Right, from Poland into Russia in 1812. And that was likely in the back of Grant and Lincoln's mind as well. And, everyone knew that this march to the sea would be risky and dangerous, but it was a problem Sherman had to overcome if he wanted permission to attempt it. And that's the thing, is he's sitting there and he has this idea, but the pain in the butt was Hood. And this is, you're right to a point, he'd be kind of a nuisance because he was the one who was standing in the way. Because it was around this time that John Bell Hood began to move his army. And like I said, he was desperate and he was angry about Sherman's exodus of those citizens in Atlanta. And what Hood wanted to do was march into Chattanooga and then to Nashville and tear up the tracks along that Western and Atlantic Railroad, cutting off Sherman's supplies and choking the army. I mean, he also had this pie-in-the-sky idea that he was maybe going to blast right through Nashville, go into Kentucky, and maybe go to Ohio and
go to Paris eventually,
Canada, and Santa's workshop. And,
Canada.
but he was going to go far. I mean, those stories are debated, but it was a grandiose plan itself. So on Thursday, September 8th, Hood began to put his own plan into motion. But before he did, though, he did something very controversial in his Confederate army. He demanded that the president, Jefferson Davis, remove the experienced and very popular General William Hardee from his army, who he blamed personally for the losses in Atlanta, right? Wow. Specifically the Battle of Jonesboro. But here's the thing. Davis actually acquiesced to this request, and he transferred Hardee to Charleston, South Carolina, to command the departments of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. So what does that do? It upsets the troops greatly. Yeah. Especially those who blamed Hood personally for those losses in Atlanta.
Well, I'm sure Claiborne was not happy with that. Well, that's one of his good friends.
But the men, he was very popular. So what do when things aren't happy?
Yep.
They desert. So the Confederates started to desert from the Army of Tennessee in record numbers. And so now Davis realizes, oh boy, I got a problem now.
But he's going around telling everybody, oh, don't worry, Sherman's not going to be a problem.
Well, right. But he has to personally visit the troops now in Macon, Georgia on Thursday, September 22nd, and try to raise their morale like a football coach, and remind the men the cause was not lost. And to what you just said, that Sherman's supply line was not sustainable, right? Now, a week later, on the 29th of September, Hood will move his army northwest at a brisk 18 miles per day, Mary. You can't go 18 miles per day.
I could if I tried.
You couldn't drive 18 miles a day, probably. But he's going to do that to begin to attack Sherman's supply line. And this is where the shenanigans take place for the most part, right? By October 2nd, Sherman is getting reports that Hood was beginning to make attacks on the Western and Atlantic Railroad northwest of Atlanta, and he quickly realized, okay, obviously this is Hood's game plan. I mean, of course that was going to be his game plan. Yeah. But he also realized now there was no way Grant nor Lincoln were ever going to consider this march to the sea under these circumstances, and he knew he had to wait.
He mentions that on October 1st to Howard. He said, I have not yet heard from General Grant as to my proposed campaign. And he also tells him, he tells Howard basically, have in mind that if Hood is going to like go over to the Alabama road and try and get into Tennessee, I may throw back to Chattanooga all of Thomas's men as far down as Kingston and draw forward all else. And he's basically telling Howard to be on alert, but he also tells Howard, keep these things to yourself. And then he tells him, the movement I propose is like what I did last fall and less than what I accomplished in February. Or it's more than what I want accomplished in February. And he said, and we could make Georgia a break in the Confederacy by ruining both east and west roads and not running against a single fort till we go to the seashore and in communication with our ships. So this is the first, place, this primary source that I found where he is mentioning this on October the 1st, this march to the sea.
Oh, it was definitely in his head, but he knew he had to protect the supply lines back to Nashville. So what you just hinted at a second ago, he will dispatch General George Thomas and his Army of the Cumberland, to Nashville to protect the city. He also knew that what he had to do and what he did, he did not want to chase Hood into Tennessee, but he had no choice. And that's something, and Sherman is not the most patient fella.
No one is, but I think he had like a certain level of trust for Thomas that he's got Thomas kind of earmarked for, okay, you are going to go do this.
It was part of a bigger plan, right?
Yeah.
So October 3rd, he realizes, okay, I've got to go deal with Hood. So he's going to leave Henry Slocum and his 12,000 men in Atlanta and then take the remaining 50K of his men to Marietta, Georgia, 15 miles north of Atlanta. Thomas will arrive in Nashville on that same day. And Sherman, again, was livid that this was happening. But again, he had no choice, and his orders were to chase Hood. Grant reminded Sherman, in quote, destroying Hood is your primary goal. Your plans are secondary. So it's kind of like slap on the back of the head. Okay,
wow.
Okay, Big Red. You're going to sit here, and you're going to deal with our plans are more important than what you want to do. So October 5th, 1864, Hood will make a significant attempt to sever Sherman's supply line on the Western Atlantic Railroad. What he's going to do, he will send General Samuel French and his 3,200 men to hit the depot protecting the railroad at a place called Allatoona Pass, the one you mentioned a little while ago, right? So to help protect the supply line, a 29-year-old general named John M. Corse is going to take control of 20 railroad cars and jam 2,000 troops into them and race to Allatoona Pass to join the 1,000 men already there to stop French. Just picture on the subway with 2,000 people.
No thanks.
No thanks. Absolutely not.
Red
right?
line at rush hour. No thank you.
And there's probably slow spots too, But Corse got a message from Sherman, who was at this point was near Kennesaw Mountain, and told him to hold out and that reinforcements were on the way. The note famously said, "Hold on, I'm coming." That's all it said. From Sherman to Corse. But Corse did more than just hold on. French's attack was a disaster, and the Rebs lost 900 men and missed the opportunity to seize over 1 million Union rations supplied there, mostly hardtack and ho-hos. For the most part, right?
And ho-hos.
But
Not
Corse,
ding-dongs?
no, they would come later, right? But Corse did not get off easy, though. He lost 700 of his 2,100 men. He also had a portion of his ear shot off. He mentions in a letter later on the battle cost him 1/3 of his men and 1/3 of his ear. Great sense of humor on him. But the Battle of Allatoona Pass, though, is credited as the first in Hood's Franklin-Nashville campaign, theoretically. Now, the battle may seem small in the grand scheme, but because John Corse saved those supplies, he may have single-handedly saved Sherman's plan for his march to the sea when you look at the big picture. Because if he failed to hold back French, Sherman's plan may have been dead on arrival for good by Grant and Lincoln. Corse was a native of Pittsburgh. He survived the war and he died at age 58, Mary, in Winchester, Massachusetts, of all places. So Corse, who was probably a Steeler fan, and just like the Steelers in the playoffs, saw his ultimate demise where? In the state of Massachusetts. It's amazing. It really, really is.
You just had to get that dig in.
Oh, God, you kidding me? So, but October 13th, though, Hood is going to continue to move and take control, or try to take control, of the railroad, again, near Ringgold, Georgia, which will be basically, and he'll face a angrier and angrier Sherman every step along the way now.
Now, is this before or after he's told Beauregard his plan?
This is before. That's coming.
That's a great story. I know you're going to tell it.
Well, but that's the whole thing. But Sherman's sick of the cat and mouse game, and he wanted to fight Hood in the open. He just wants to get done with them because if I get done with this guy, I can go to Savannah.
Well, and I think too, like, I think there was like a window where he had been like, I need to go at this point because of the, he's trying to plan it with the weather and all that, and like the crops, because they would have just been harvested in Georgia. And that's what he's trying to do. So the clock is kind of ticking with this.
He has the idea in his head how it's supposed to go, and it's going off the track, and he doesn't like it. He wants to fight Hood and targets the area around a place called Lafayette, Georgia. Now, if his march to the sea is ever going to happen, he needed to be done with Hood once and for all, and he knew it. So on October 17th, Hood was about to take the bait and attack Sherman. But before he does, he wisely calls a council of war with his subordinates, and he actually held a vote to attack. And what do his subordinates do?
They're like, no.
They all vote, they all smelled a rat, and they pulled their no-way card out and said this isn't going to happen. Because Hood understood their point, and an attack never happened. It was probably smart, but of course he was disappointed. But the one who was really disappointed, of course, was Sherman, because he thought this was going to be the opportunity.
Yeah.
I can get this guy out. He can hit me here. We're going to beat him. If you've been to Savannah, it's nice. I mean, no wonder he wants to go to Savannah, right? But Hood is going to keep moving west, and he's going to arrive in Gadsden, Alabama, where he will meet General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard.
A.k.a. Beauregard.
Beauregard, the commander of the Division of the West. Now here, Hood is going to basically explain that grand plan to Beauregard, including going to Kentucky and maybe in Ohio, and maybe we'll join Lee in Virginia.
Maybe we'll go to Canada and invade it.
We'll go to Argentina. We'll go everywhere, right? But Beauregard basically laughed in his face with his plans and told him, okay, well, that's okay.
You do you.
You do you, man. That sounds like fun. But I'll tell you this, though. If you have any idea of doing any of this, you better get a stepping, because speed is going to be your most important thing. You have to go as fast as you possibly can. And that means getting over the Tennessee River ASAFP. So to that end, Hood is going to go onto Google Maps and he look for any fords he can find that's going to cross the Tennessee River, because he had to find a place to cross this army. October 22nd, they have moved all the way through Guntersville, and now they're heading towards Decatur, Alabama. Now, the problem that they were finding every step along the way was the river was too high to cross. So Hood was forced to march parallel to the river for 20 miles west to Cortland, Alabama, along modern-day routes 20 and 72, to find a place to cross. Now it's a week later, and he found himself further west at a place called Tuscumbia, Alabama, where now his men are tired, they're sick of walking, continuing to find a place to cross the Tennessee River. And while this is all going on, Sherman is getting more and more and more angry, because he's being forced to chase Hood, and he realized that, okay, this guy obviously wants to cross the Tennessee River. That's what he wants to do. And then he's thinking, well, if he crosses the Tennessee and he wants to go to the Ohio River, that's cool, because now that's where Thomas is. So his quote was, if Hood wants to go to the Ohio River, I'll give him the rations. Let Hood go north. My business is down south.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and he does go. And I think here too, this gets into this whole like thing with, Thomas he's in Nashville now, but Grant is still like, I don't know. And this goes back to the whole, like, I think there is still mistrust against Thomas by Lincoln and Grant, but Sherman has now been on an entire campaign with Thomas, the Atlanta campaign. And I think he has come to trust him a little bit more than what he once did because of that. And that's why he's trying to tell Grant, no, trust me, they're going to be good with Thomas there. It's going to be fine.
You're absolutely right. Sherman knew he knew he could not let Hood get clean to Nashville. He knew that, despite the fact that Thomas was there waiting. So what he does do is he dispatches General John Schofield and his 12,000 men to go to Nashville to join Thomas. And this is going to give Thomas and Schofield 80,000 men, which is plenty to deal with Hood's broken and smaller army. And this is helping him build his case now, to Grant anyway, that he should be allowed to go and proceed with his march to the sea plan. Basically, look, there's 80,000 guys there. You don't need me anymore. Yeah. So if Hood wants to go up there to Nashville, let him knock himself out. We'll take care of him there. You don't need me. And so he begins again to try to convince Grant that the supply line was safe, but everything falls apart for Sherman here. Because on November 4th, 1864, what happens? Nathan Bedford Forrest almost destroyed any hope of Sherman getting support from Grant in one swoop. On this date, Forrest and his cavalry, they're going to raid the garrison at a place called Johnsonville, Tennessee. And what they're going to do there is destroy the supply base and a gunboat that was defending it. Forrest will inflict $6 million in losses of supplies, and Grant was mortified. He couldn't believe it. This was awful news for Sherman because he knew the further he kept chasing Hood, the whole point of his march to the sea is going to be moot and going to be lost. And now, with the supply line being attacked, he was losing his case to Grant that he's got men in Nashville ready to deal with him. Don't worry about it. But Sherman again decided to keep petitioning Grant for his approval. It became borderline begging at this point. Yep. And Sherman writes, "If we can march a well-appointed army right through Jeff Davis's territory, it is a demonstration to the world that we have a power that Davis cannot resist." And then what is this famous line?
"I can make this march and make Georgia howl."
Exactly. This is where the line comes from. So again, Grant is like, "I don't know, Davy," right? Yep. But he says, he's going to say, "Well, I'm going to write to Lincoln. I'm going to send him your details of your plan, and we'll see what the guy with the hat says." So he sends the plan to Lincoln about Sherman's plan for the march to the sea. And Lincoln initially felt the plan would be about as successful as a Buffalo Bills field goal attempt in the playoffs. And he's like, no. But Grant trusted Sherman. He felt that, okay, if he's being this persistent, then maybe it was valid. And so Grant focused on that to Lincoln. And finally Lincoln relented and said, okay, you know what? If you think that's the right case, then let him do it. So Grant responded back to Sherman's note with one line. It simply wrote, "Go on as you propose."
And what day was that? November 9th or 8th, right?
I think it was November 8th, I believe it was.
Yeah, November the 8th. And so just keep in mind here that this happens. He gets approval for this on November the 8th. He rolls out of Atlanta on November the 15th. So he's already been getting the ball rolling on this march because it's going to take, there's so much planning that has to go into this that he clearly was basically what he knew once Grant gave the orders, he could go within less than a week.
Well, he had everything set up, though. I mean,
Yep.
As soon as he finds out he can go, I mean, he probably did a couple of, handsprings and,
Yep.
yelled a few times.
He found out on Howard's 34th birthday.
Oh, God, Howard. But so he does a complete 180, marches right back to Atlanta, where he will rejoin Henry Slocum, and he'll get there on the 14th of November. And it's funny because the next day on the 15th, it was one of those weird moments in military history where you have Sherman's army and Hood's armies, which had been in each other's hair for months. And now they both begin to march in opposite directions with a goal that had nothing to do with each other. Yeah. It's just a weird coincidence, right? But again, before he leaves Atlanta, Sherman had one thing to do, and it was something that is still talked about to this day, and that is he had to destroy anything in the city that could be used to help the Confederate war effort. So he will order his chief engineer, a guy named Orlando Poe, to destroy warehouses and factories with this big battering ram they had, first and foremost. But he also ordered him to destroy railroads, locomotives, stations, roads, those 3 DQs I mentioned.
3 DQs.
Anything that they felt the Rebs could use when they would re-inhabit Atlanta after Sherman left, because he knew they would. So on the night of November 15th, Poe and his men took the torch to Atlanta's industrial area. As the band played, as the fire spread, I think they played "We Didn't Start the Fire" by Billy Joel. I think that's exactly what they played. But what's interesting is, you know what they used to start the fires, for the kindling?
It was the slavery where they sold the slaves,
It was
right?
the Negro sale signs.
Wow.
That's what they used to start. It's just
So
interesting.
yeah, anyone who's seen that famous picture from
I've
Atlanta.
been there, the metro station.
Yep.
I drove there to go see it one time. It was definitely a rolls up the windows and lock the door situation.
Isn't that most of Atlanta?
Well, no, it's not like that. But Sherman was interesting, though, because he had ordered only buildings that had war-making facilities be burned. He didn't want any residential areas touched. He also ordered any rogue arsonist or looter to be shot on sight. He also insisted that he be present when all fires were lit. And again, this is all wink and stuff. He
has to have this officially written down. And there is a story where like they set fire to one building and the fire spread to the next building and they didn't realize there was all these shells in there and the shells kept blowing up all night. Like there's that story.
But he was not heartbroken to see the fire spreading. I mean, he was not playing Adele songs and crying in the corner. Okay. I mean, he had orders of things not to happen, but the fire did burn out of control and spread into those residential areas famously. When the army left Atlanta, over 200 acres of the city were blackened. 37% of Atlanta was completely destroyed in less than 24 hours. And again, you have to wonder if Sherman, looking over his shoulder, seeing the city burning, if he was seeing a premonition of what was to come on his next phase of his plan.
Yeah, like Columbia.
Well, all of it, though. I mean, the thing of it, despite despite arguably his best intentions, okay, in some cases, the burning of Atlanta, it brought out the worst in some of his men who burned and plundered at will despite his orders. And again, we don't know, it's not like he was killing himself to stop this, but there were orders that existed, but it clearly got out of control. The next day on the 16th, the Wednesday of November, Sherman is going to ride out of Atlanta. He was finally happy. He was beginning his march to the sea after months of doing everything in his power to get permission to do so. And he was also happy. Why? Because it was the first time in his military career that he was completely on his own.
Yep. They are on their own. They have cut the telegraph lines deliberately so there can be nothing sent back. Howard does write his wife and say, like, this is probably the last letter I'll write you because we basically have to go dark for the next little while. And he's not going to write her again until December the 15th, 1864. November the 8th, 1864 is the letter he writes before the march, and December the 15th is when he's finally able to write her back again. But there is so much planning that goes into this march, and I know you had you had some stuff about the soldiers that are selected for this march.
Well, right. I mean, if you're going to march 285 miles, in a very meticulous march, you have to have the right people. So what Sherman did is anybody he deemed sick, wounded, wore elastic waistband pants, they were all left behind. Only the fittest soldiers were allowed to make the march. So when it was all said and done, that army was whittled down to a total of 62,000 men. 55,000 had to walk, 5,000 rode on a horse, and the remaining 2,000 would ride in those artillery wagons. Each man carried just 40 rounds of ammo, while 2,500 wagons carried additional firepower. The troops carried just 20 days of rations, Mary. Salt pork, hardtack, ho-hos, coffee.
Ho-hos.
And for the most part, they only had 5 days' worth of oats for their horses. They also brought 4 collapsible pontoon bridges to be used in case they came upon an unexpected waterway, because the message to Halleck probably wasn't going to be delivered. The ghost of Fredericksburg, maybe, but still.
He'd ignore it.
There you go. But he brought their own. But he organized his army into 2 wings, and they're going to march 30 miles apart. And the way the formation of this is very, very interesting.
It is. So, they are each 30 miles apart, but then the 2 columns and the wings are more miles apart. And it results in some days it's going to be 60 miles. That this swath, this kind of Robert L. O'Connell in his biography about Sherman, Fierce Patriot, calls it a land shark. On the right side, the right wing, is going to be commanded by General Oliver Otis Howard.
Who?
And he is actually Sherman's second in command on this march. He has the 15th Corps with him, with Peter J. Osterhaus, what was his nickname again?
Oosterhouse?
Oosterhaus. I can never say his name right.
His nickname was Sow Belly.
God.
The thing about that we miss, about the Civil War, I realize it was a horrible experience. It had the best nicknames.
But it also had the best, given names, like states' rights.
Well, it did, but I mean...
And what's his name? Sterling A.M. Wood.
Right. But Oosterhaus was a guy from the 15th Corps he was a German man, and he was very hard on his men, as was Francis P. Blair from the 17th Corps, who was with him, who had a reputation of charging his men like a herd of cattle, right?
Yep. And on the left wing, you have General Henry Warner Slocum of Gettysburg fame, obviously. Well, so is Howard. But Slocum is also going to have with him the most Eastern troops on this campaign. And he is going to have with him the 14th Corps, commanded by General Jefferson C. Davis, who was not my favorite person at all, and the 20th Corps, commanded by General Alpheus S. Williams, who people who study Gettysburg will recognize this name. But I think you have a little bit of a story about Davis.
Well, I mean, the thing about it, though, is that these were mostly Western troops in this march, and there was Eastern troops here on the left wing. They were not thought of very highly. They were called paper collar soldiers. It was mostly guys in this side. Now, the men did not like Jefferson C. Davis. I mean, basically, they didn't trust him because of his...
I don't like him.
Well, they didn't trust him because of his name, of many things.
Also murdered Bull Nelson, right?
Well, but I know, but the rank and file guys, right? But they hated him. They just did not like him. There's a story where men from the 17th Ohio, they shaved the tail of Jefferson C. Davis's favorite horse. And when the general saw it, he lost his mind and demanded to know who did this to his horse. Not a single man ratted him out, even though there was a $500 reward being offered by Davis for the name of the person who did it. They didn't like him. Alpheus Williams, the men called him Pops. He commanded the 20th Corps, and again, they were most of those Eastern theater guys. And this is the army that they basically had. So you have, again, a total of 55,000 infantry in 4 different army corps. The cavalry was commanded by our friend Judson Kilpatrick with his 5,000 men.
Who is
Sherman,
the exact idiot that Sherman needed.
Sherman, of course, Kilpatrick, of course, his nickname was Kill Cavalry for his reckless charges early in the war. He was the only army officer to pose for a photograph with prostitutes during the war. Jeez. But Sherman did not like him, but he appreciated his aggressiveness. And Sherman's quote about Kilpatrick, he said, and I quote, speaking of Kilpatrick, I know he's a hell of a damn fool, but I want that sort of man to command my cavalry in this expedition. So again, it's the army of misfit toys in a lot of different ways. Yeah. But Sherman knew to live off the land, speed was a necessity. He knew he needed to have the right men to do it, but he also knew that the rebels in front of him were likely going to be militia, old men and young boys.
As they're going to find out at Griswoldville.
Right, and that's what's going to basically happen. He did know, though, that there was cavalry under Joseph Wheeler, the War Child. Another great nickname, Mary. His 3,500, man cavalry was there too. But they're going to be more of, like you mentioned, Hood being the fly, the nuisance. Yep. That's more of what Wheeler was. They weren't really a real threat. But again, Sherman's moving 12 to 15 miles a day, and he knew he had to do so to get to Savannah before Christmas, which is what his goal was.
Yeah, and he issues on November the 9th, 1864, Special Field Orders number 120. And we're not going to go over these in complete detail, but just kind of hit on the major points of them. So these are issued at Kingston, Georgia, which is just outside Atlanta. So the first one was what we just talked about. It's detailing who the wing commanders are in Howard and Slocum. And it's going to say the habitual order of march will be, whenever practicable, by 4 roads as near parallel as possible and converging at points hereafter to be indicated. It says that the separate columns are to start by 7 a.m. and march 15 miles a day. He's going to have 2,520 wagons and 5,500 head of cattle at the beginning of the march. And the other part of this is the army will forage liberally on the country during this march. Each brigade commander is going to organize a good and sufficient foraging party at the beginning of each day under the command of 1 or more discreet officers. The soldiers are not to enter any dwellings, which I think they broke that rule pretty quickly, or commit any trespasses. Now, this is one of those ones where Sherman's kind of looking away like, whatever, didn't happen. These are the bummers that are so famous. Mm-hmm. And there would have been 3,000 of them daily go out and live off the land. And this is another part of the orders too, that yes, the soldiers are sent with rations to last them a certain amount of time, but for the most part, they are to live off the land. The bummers are basically Civil War trick-or-treaters. They will show up at your house.
What kind of trick-or-treaters in your neighborhood, Mary? They don't come into your house to home invasion, steal the turkey out of the fridge.
Civil War trick-or-treat, home invasion. It's a home invasion. But yeah, but these guys are also the ones, so it's estimated that because there was 3,000 of them a day, and they weren't always the same men, that there would have been an opportunity on the march for every man to be a bummer at some point. And these are the guys that would come back at the end of every day, and they were kind of like, it's sad to say, they were like the entertainment, because some of them would come back in women's dresses, they had these hats on, so they were taking more than just food, which is, where these stories start to, about how bad these men were. But those are the bummers that they're going to be foraging off the land. The other part of the Special Order 120 is the Army Corps commanders are entrusted to with the power to destroy mills, houses, cotton gins, etc. If the rebels could get a hold of them and use them for the purposes of war. If there were guerrillas or bushwhackers bothering the march, the army commanders were ordered to basically devastate any area. This is very similar to the orders that Sheridan received in the Shenandoah Valley.
Well, right. I mean, bushwhackers, for the most part, are not, theoretically, aren't army. They're just local riffraff who will cause them problems in a lot of cases. We talk about the John R. Megg story, right?
Yep.
Back in the valley, where he's killed by 3 men wearing raincoats. They think they're bushwhackers. In Sheridan, he didn't take that too well. He burned everything within a 3-mile radius of Dalton in Virginia because of that. So this was the reputation they had. But the people who were the bummers equally had a horrible reputation in the Confederate Army. So these people were people that almost considered non-combatants. They were basically like just scavages, savages. Scavengers.
The bummers are the regular soldiers, but for the day that they're a bummer, they're going out and they're like ransacking everything.
If you're going and we talk about when the bummers were, we're talking about Dahlgren's raid, Henry Wise. We talked about him a long time ago. They were trying to find his house, Confederate part of the politics, because they wanted to make an example out of him. That's what these people were. So again, these people going into homes and stealing stuff and causing these problems were not thought of very highly.
Well, no, I wouldn't think very highly if someone's like, "Hi, I'm going to come take your cows and your horses now."
I wouldn't like that one bit.
So I get it, but at the same time, this is part of this total war that Sherman is doing to expedite the end of the war, to lessen the lives that could be potentially lost.
Well, right, that's the whole thing. It's psychological warfare. Because if you've got men in Petersburg or you've got men heading towards Nashville, and you find out that your homes, your families are being threatened in Georgia, you're gonna take off.
You're gonna think differently about it.
You're gonna maybe think about leaving, and that was a big strategy, a big part of it.
Yeah.
But again, that's part of the why the March to the Sea remains in the imagination even today in Civil War historians and enthusiasts, because of all the ramifications psychologically. That it did.
Yeah, and the other part of this too, this special orders, is the African Americans. So the freed slaves are mentioned in this. And Sherman does say in these orders that they could be taken along, but each army commander had to bear in mind what the supplies were for their own men too. But this is where you run into things like Ebenezer Creek as well.
I mean, that's the thing too. I mean, we're not going to go too all the details of this, but I think at the end of the day, what it really is, Sherman, for the most part, I mean, he's interesting because he's a very fascinating person from a psychological Monday morning psychologist. I mean, I'm not a psychologist, Mary, but I'll take a look at it. That's my extent of psychology in my history. But he was for some, he was a very definition of brutality. And in as many cases, his total war was something that this country had never seen up to that point. And for others, Sherman was a man who, although he was capital R racist, let's not call it.
Oh, God, yeah, he was, yeah.
He was no friend of the African American, but he saw defending the Union as the most important thing. But the thing about him, though, he's as vicious as he was also very kind. He said during the war, when peace does come, you can call on me for anything, and I will share with you the last cracker and shield your homes and family against dangers from every single corner. And that's the thing, though. He was very multifaceted. He hated the media. He hated, although he never acknowledged his own errors. It was never his fault.
Oh, no. If you read his memoirs, you will not find a single error in there. One time, the great quote about with the media is he's like, well, if we sent all the reporters to hell, we'd have reports from there before noon. If we sent them there at 9, we'd have reports from them by noon.
He hated the media. He considered Washington corrupt as hell. He blamed the politicians for the war. He considered democracy in general as nothing more than mob rule. I mean, he did in a lot of different ways. There are a million different opinions of Sherman, and the mere mention of his name brings upon emotion, both positive or negative. But the thing about it, though, at the end of the day, it cannot be denied that Sherman's march to the sea, one that he really had to sell and came this close to not happening, as we've discussed here,
Yep.
was one of the most defining moments in the American Civil War. Whether in reality or perception, because again, we've talked before about this, it's probably more important historical memory than military, realistically speaking.
I think so, and I think Sherman saw it that way too. If you read in his memoirs, he simply saw it as this, now he's writing his memoirs many years later, so he's able to say, oh, I just saw it as a, change of my base of operations. He worried more about the Carolinas campaign because he was going into where secession had initially happened, and he was worried he wouldn't be able to control his men. If you read if you read Trudeau's Southern Storm or Robert L. O'Connell's Fierce Patriot, they do a really good job of explaining the march. But the march was kind of this reprieve for the men who were on it in a way, that they didn't have to really worry about the battles anymore, that they were just doing this march kind of thing, not to, say make light of it or whatever, but still it is a very big military operation. And it was one that Sherman, when he did it, he had in his mind that this is a way to lessen the lives that would be lost in what was a very, very brutal year of the Civil War in 1864.
No, it absolutely was. And it was kind of the grand finale in a lot of different ways. It got progressively worse every year. We mentioned earlier in the beginning of this that the strategy and the style had changed as the war went on. 64 was, you had the Overland campaign going. You had Atlanta going on. You obviously had Franklin. You had all these horrific events of this war that was culminating in this, the end. And we've said before that everything after Atlanta is probably window dressing, because it sealed Lincoln's election, and that was pretty much the end of it. But again, what the March to the Sea does, it captures the imagination even today. I mean, obviously, Margaret Mitchell's book.
Oh yeah,
Gone with the Wind. It talks a lot about that.
That fear, where you never actually see Sherman in that movie, but there's that fear of him, and I think that kind of shows just who he had become. He's even in that time, he's a cult of personality, and he is considered the first celebrity general that the U.S. has, because he's very much I don't know, I think he, in a way, he kind of enjoys it, but he's got this cult of personality with him as well that comes with that.
No, he does. And after the war, he was a hero, and he did a lot of speeches and there's a lot of little things. But to his credit, though, he always minimized the march. He considered the March to the Sea nothing more than a change of location of his army. But again, he's being disingenuous here, because if that were the case, why did he make such an effort to sell it on Grant?
Yep.
So again, it makes a big deal about it. But I think when we talk about this, people, you look at Atlanta, Grant gets there. I mean, Sherman gets there, and then it's well, now he just marches to the sea. People don't always realize how much went on between Atlanta falling and the march beginning in November, and that's because of Hood.
Yep.
Hood was an unexpected pain in the butt for Sherman that he had to deal with. And it took, putting 80,000 men into Nashville to block him from Hood from getting there and destroying that supply line that really was moot at that point. It allowed Sherman to go east.
Yep.
And the rest is history.
Yep. And I think too, it also, again, it shows that the trust that, and I didn't really think about this until researching this episode, and I was looking at wow, he's just throwing Thomas in there. And I mean, General George Henry Thomas is one of the most underrated figures of the Civil War, I think. And obviously we don't know as much about him because he didn't write memoirs, because unfortunately when he died, he ordered his wife to burn his papers. But I think Sherman sending him to Nashville, telling him to go there, shows the level of trust that Sherman had gained in him. And I think it's from the Atlanta campaign. If you look at how closely those two had to work together, whereas somebody like Grant and Lincoln had already, Lincoln, we know, didn't trust Thomas because he was a Virginian. There's quotes that very explicitly explain that. And Grant hadn't worked with him as long as Sherman had. And I think the other part of this story is the trust that Sherman gained for Thomas, that he was able to say to him, you go there, I trust you to deal with Hood. And that's another part of this March to the Sea that doesn't get talked about enough either.
I mean, when you think about that five-pronged attack we talked about, all those machinations moving all at the same time, it was a big one. And he got to Atlanta pretty quickly, took it, and then he was able to forge his secondary plan. So it's a fascinating study. There's no question. And then there's been many books written about this. You mentioned the O'Connell book, obviously the Trudeau book. There's books about the March to the Sea that go on and on and on. But again, it's something that, it captures the imagination of even the casual Civil War person. Everyone knows what the March to the Sea is. Everyone does, whether you're a big fan of Robert E. Lee or a big fan of Sarah Lee. It doesn't matter. Everyone knows the March to the Sea because of Margaret Mitchell and Gone with the Wind and all the stories that have come out. Because, again, when you're looking at history, it's the story of stories. Yeah. And that's what it is.
The other great book I want to mention about it is by Anne Sarah Rubin, who I had on a few years ago for a book club. And it's called, it's about Sherman's March in Historical Memory. And she actually went in Ebenezer Creek. So kudos to her.
Nah, she did. So that's awesome. Good. So what's up for us next, Mary? What's new with us?
So next we are going to be recording an episode with a guest.
Oh,
right?
That's right.
Yes.
I forgot about that. We're gonna be talking with Robert K.D. Colby, who wrote a fantastic book called The Unholy Traffic, which is about the slave trade in the 1840s and 50s and 60s. And it's a fascinating book because it really goes into the economics of slavery and how instrumental it was in the North and the South, and how it changed as the Union Army dug through the South, and how it changed the economy. So we will schedule that date with him. I know he's a busy guy. He was just here in Gettysburg last week with the Lincoln Convention, so he's back home now. So we'll get that scheduled the next couple of weeks, and then we'll have some more shenanigans planned, Mary.
We will hopefully be doing another roundtable soon, and we will be sitting down to decide on some more episodes to do. Especially for in the new year and that. But in the meantime, happy Thanksgiving to all of our listeners. We thank you for listening to us these 139 episodes, and especially thank you to you, Darren, for being the awesome podcast host you are and marching along with me for these 139 episodes.
Well, I am thankful for you, Mary. Thanksgiving is a Civil War holiday, you know.
I know. Thank you to Abraham Lincoln.
Absolutely. So enjoy your turkey, enjoy your stuffing, enjoy your pie, enjoy your Cowboys loss. Have a great day. So off we go. Any final words from you, Fincheroo?
No, just thank you again to our listeners, and thank you to you, Darren, for being the awesome podcast co-host you are.
Mary, the pleasure was all yours. All right. Guys, have a great holiday weekend. Stay safe, and we'll talk to you all on the other side.
See y'all later.
Peace out.
Bye.